My name's Joe Hill. I'm the director of Focal Point Gallery. We've been programming a series of different activities down here, including exhibitions. Unfortunately, the one tonight is hidden behind this curtain, but so you're forced to come back and see it another time. As well as music, talks and events. And this is a new series that we've started up, really, which is about looking at supporting the artist community in the East to in different ways through some of the expertise from some of our expertise and some of the people that we partner and work with on issues like funding, applying for commissions, and various different opportunities that people might be able to take advantage of as creative people. So we thought this evening we'd kick this programme off with a discussion looking at the notion of applying for public art, and it's particularly poignant at the moment because we're part of a project that spreads across the entire east of the country from, let me get this right, Matt, Bedford, the whole of the south, well, the whole of the east basically, which is sort of Bedford right over to Norfolk in the east. And it's a number of organisations, 20 different galleries and nine different galleries and creative institutions that have set out on a path to basically to commission 10 major pieces of public art for the eastern region and work together to deliver those in partnership. So I'm sure some of you may have read some of the information that's out on the web about the project and things. The deadline for the project is this Sunday at midnight, so there's not an enormous amount of time. I'm really sorry this was the only time we could program this in. But what we thought we'd do is bring together a panel of people to talk to you and be here for your questions. So what we'll do is each one of our speakers, and I'll introduce them in just a moment, will speak for a short period, and then we'll open it out to questions from the floor. So if anybody's got any burning questions about the commission or just generally about applying for different types of public art commissions, then that's the moment to do it. So first of all, on my left, we've got Matt Nightingale, who is the project manager for the new Geographies project. So Matt is responsible for realising this enormous and ambitious project. And he will be here speaking at the end to answer some of your questions that you've got specifically, and we've even got the application here so we can talk through it if you want to look at it in specifics. Then we've got Rose Lejeune, who is a curator and academic and writer and everything basically, and has worked in public art in many different fields, and she's going to speak a little bit about the different models of public art and different types of commissioning, because I always think it's good to understand the complete field of what you're going into. Then we've got Kiera Blakey from Art in the Underground, which he'll be talking a little bit about her experiences of commissioning in challenging spaces and for challenging audiences. And we've got the wonderful Alan Kane, who is an artist who's worked in the public realm many, many times, and we are working with him on a Radical Essex project called the Radical National Trust of South Essex, which is an ongoing archiving project which will have all sorts of wonderful fruitions in the future. So what I'm going to do now is hand over firstly to Rose, who's going to talk a little bit about different public art models. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Joe. So I haven't particularly prepared anything, I have to say, because it's a bit of a surprise that I'm going to talk about all of the different versions of public art models this evening. But I was just thinking about actually different places that I've worked. And so as a way of slightly introducing myself as well and thinking through that question a little bit, I have worked, for example, at the Serpentine Gallery in London, running their education programme. I ran a series of Cultural Olympiad projects from 2009 to 2013, working mainly based at the Barbican in London, all across the kind of east of London. And most recently, I've been working with Joe and the team at Focal Point to look at how public art has happened in the city and in the kind of borough of Southend. So we've been doing things in Shoeburyness, and also we've been looking a little bit at the history of public art in the area. And so in that sense, I've been kind of trying to think not just about ways of commissioning, but also how public art gets archived, how it's been remembered, its relationship to cultural memory, its relationship to architecture, its relationship to all sorts of kind of civic roles, and how that's changed in the last, maybe, what have we been looking at, kind of 30 or 40 years. So in terms of those kind of more recent projects, I guess a little bit of what I've been thinking about in terms of those different models is essentially a difference between some things being kind of very artist-led, that is, from the point of view of being a curator, having started with a conversation with an artist and really thinking about that as a way of developing something that really comes very strongly from that kind of vision. And then maybe perhaps what the work that I do with Southend, which is a bit more thinking about what opportunities come up through, for example, real estate development, or say in Shoeburyness, for example, there's a whole new housing development that we've been working on and a new primary school that we've been working with, and really thinking about the relationship of art and artists to those kinds of civic developments. So that as a way of working is much more based on in that sense, a pot of money coming first, and then asking some questions about how artists can interact with designers, can interact with architects, can interact with local authorities, schools, education programs, and so on. So I think really there's a kind of, in terms of what we might be talking about tonight, there's a kind of a way of thinking about how a public art commission is not just something that sits on its own, but something that's very context specific in that way. And a lot of what our job as curators or as developers is to think about that role between an artist's vision and a specific context. And really in that sense, what I do is to help manifest an artist's ideas within what can be a very complicated set of arrangements in terms of a local authority, a school, a set of funding partners, all sorts of different personalities, should we say, and in that sense, very, it's not, I think that there actually aren't all that many different models of public art commissioning, but there is often a very complex web of coordinates that one has to kind of understand and think through. But I suppose in terms of the conversation that we're having here tonight, I would probably stress that that's not necessarily the role of the artist. That's the role of the curator, to help think that stuff through and to be able to understand that and to think about how to maintain the integrity of a project within that network. So it's really a question about thinking about context and thinking about how to tell those stories in different ways, given what different objectives and different criteria people might have within that process.
Yeah, I suppose just to give you a little bit of detail to fill in on Rose talking about this particular project. Essentially, each institution involved in this project will work on 2 of these commissions, and that means that, for example, Focal Point is one of those partners. We may be working on a commission in Norfolk or in Cambridge. It won't necessarily be in Essex, and somebody in those areas may be working on a commission on our doorstep here, which I think poses a lot of interesting opportunities for artists and for curators as well. I mean, it's actually a project that really helps to develop curators in the same way as it does artists. But it also poses a fresh sort of set of challenges, I think, in the way that, you know, I along with Rose and in other projects, have been involved in public art quite extensively. And, you know, I've worked for a private public art commissioner, so whereby developers and councils might approach a particular company, and there are a number of them out there, to help them commission artists for particular developments. And often you find that those companies have a long list of artists that they tend to pull out on a regular basis, and it's really advantageous for artists to try and get on those lists if you can do so. Be in touch with some of the people that work in those companies, and demonstrate yourself as a sort of public artist, really. But what the challenges here will be us trying to negotiate new relationships with councils, with local spokespeople, to try and help the artists to deliver their vision, really. I don't know, Rose, if you've got anything else to add to that. The other thing I just wanted to ask about, because I think a lot of people in the room are not fully aware of it, and I'm hoping Rose can tell us a little bit about Section 106 and what that actually means. And
literally been doing that today.
Well, okay, let's move on to Kiera Blakey then. So Kiera obviously works for Art on the Underground, and seamlessly is going to speak next about Section 106 and some of those challenges.
Yeah, so I'm a curator at Art on the Underground, and we commission projects in many different formats. So some of them are more in a kind of traditional sense that we might think of public art. So they might be something that's a bit more embedded in the kind of structure of a station. So something that's really very long term, and you work very, very closely with the council, with architects, and that can take anything from sort of 3 to 10 years. And I also work on projects that are much more temporal, so kind of performance in public space. And the other side is this kind of horrific Section 106, which I have been trawling around South London, trying to battle with Nina, who's in the audience today. And Section 106 is when a developer has to deliver a cultural strategy. So because I work for Transport for London and we are developing 2 new stations in South London, part of the legislation or the obligation of that is that you deliver something cultural. And that's quite dependent on who that person is in terms of what that output is. So it can be a really, really exciting opportunity, but sometimes it can kind of be a bit more kind of tokenistic. Maybe, yeah. So I suppose what I'm interested in is public art that's much more embedded in the kind of infrastructure of a site and an area. And when I talk about what I do, I always kind of talk about the Jeremy Deller project, which was probably like 11 years ago now. And it's why I wanted to work at Art in the Underground, because it took the kind of existing structures of the city. So we kind of sometimes refer to the kind of turd in the plaza, the kind of plop down art and how and what. And that's kind of that's relationship to the kind of public and to the kind of locale. But what was great about Jeremy's project is that it really looked at the station, the people that use the station, and the way the station operates already. So what Jeremy did was create a project called What is the City but the People, which is an amazing title. I love it. And he created... Yeah, true. But it's great because it was a booklet that was a kind of series of quotes that were kind of philosophical and funny, and he gave them to train drivers to read over the standard train announcements. So it became part of your journey every day, but it humanized the network. So I always kind of go on about this to artists when I'm working with them, like what are the existing structures, what's the fabric of the city, and how can we utilize those in an interesting way. You wanted me to talk a little bit about challenges. I mean, I think Rose has spoken quite a lot about that in terms of like all the different kind of people we have to navigate when we work in the public realm. And hopefully that's something that you'll kind of be protected from. But there's often lots of competing expectations. So what Nina and I have been trying to navigate today is we went into a meeting with the council and it was kind of quite a frosty reception. And you slowly have to kind of massage this relationship. And it takes a long time. And we're going to work together for 2.5 years probably on this project. I've spent sort of the last 6 months trying to get to know them, getting to know the environment. And then they just told me that they're leaving in April. So all that work's kind of gone. So you've got this kind of, this kind of city or this kind of area in flux. So it's quite interesting to think about who are those communities and the places that you're thinking about putting a work of art. What is the role of art in that community actually? And what are the different expectations of the different people that kind of constitute that place as well? I think
there was another thing actually I was thinking about in relation particularly to Art on the Underground is, and we come across it a lot when thinking about the big screen in Southend and some of the temporary commissions. There's one of them on the screen up here by an artist based in Southend called Scotty. Is really about, for artists, what are the things to consider when thinking about audiences and these spaces, because it's a very different context to the safety of a gallery space, isn't it? So I wondered if you had any advice for the people out that are here tonight about what really you need to think about in relation to the work and the audiences.
I mean, on a complete practical level, your audience is quite generally a non-art audience. So for something like the railway bridge project, it's a very transitory audience. So they're like going home from work or they're shopping. So they're not there to see art. So that's kind of on a fundamental level. And there's really practical things about how you embed something, but also how something is quite self-sufficient, because it can be quite, you can be super ambitious, but the reality is that part of the bridge might be owned by so-and-so, and the floor might be owned by someone else, and it could take you 10 years to try and find out who that person is, and it's infuriating. I mean, it took me 2 years to get a bin in a project that I was doing in Seven Sisters. It was absolutely ridiculous. So you have to kind of straddle your expectations as well, I think. And then, I mean, I don't know how long the kind of legacy of the projects are that you're kind of hoping to do, but there's a certain, you know, the kind of temporality of a project. So like really basic things about materials, like how things are going to survive in the elements.
And with the public, I suppose, as well, because there is a tendency for... I mean,
Yeah.
me and Rose have experienced this with the commission that we've been working on in Shrewsbury. Essentially, some of the proposals came in, and the council workers, our colleagues, let's say, said people can burn that, somebody will scratch that, somebody will steal that, they'll spray on that, they'll hide behind that, they'll sell it for scrap. And in the end, you know, you end up with a sort of bomb-proof block of lead, because there's nothing else that can actually withstand. And that's where I think the conversations with these people become really important, explaining that actually maybe it doesn't really matter if this thing is damaged or affected by the people that live there, or maybe there's a reason why this object is being vandalised or attacked by the residents, and that's because the commissions that you've put in previously haven't involved them in the process of developing the work. And I think that's very much where, you know, I see a role for public art is in coming out of the communities that they end up inhabiting, and particularly with the Bridge Commissions have been a long-standing series of works that we've done, and they were initiated by the previous director of Focal Point Gallery, but we've continued them just partly because there is such a cost-effective way of having huge impact with a temporary commission. You know, you've got hundreds of thousands of people travelling up and down Southend High Street, and these are simply vinyl banners that are cable tied onto a Network Rail bridge. Don't get me started on Network Rail, because they're even worse than Art on the Underground or the Underground. So getting permission for this, for a series of commissions, was a challenging undertaking, but now we have that permission and that relationship. We can continue to commission what are essentially quite cheap public art that have the most impact probably of anything we do at Focal Point Gallery, but they're sometimes the cheapest things we actually work on. So in terms of when thinking about budget and financing a commission, it doesn't have to be bronze, doesn't have to be the most expensive material. Sometimes the simplest way of doing something can have enormous impact. Rose, did you want to add something to that?
I mean, I think obviously all of those things are completely true. And I mean, for example, with Art on the Underground, everything has to be, you know, fire retardant to a particular, but also there's a question about content, for example. So if you put it on the London Underground, you can't talk about the Queen, you can't talk about this, you can't, you know, there's very specific, you can't do things backwards, and you know, there's very specific regulations that you can't. But that said, there are also, I think, opportunities that are kind of turning up the whole time. So for example, just to stick with the Art on the Underground thing, I think a lot of us on this panel have had something to do with TFL at some point. You know, now, for example, there's screens everywhere all of a sudden that weren't there 5 years ago. So there's an opportunity there for artists who are interested in technology or who are thinking about that idea of a journey up an escalator with a series of screens, or, you know, that even though there are huge kind of considerations that are really basic and really either materially based or that you would have to be aware of in terms of what you can and can't put as content into the public domain, like that, there are lots of things that simply could not say for good reason. But then there are opportunities because the public realm is changing the whole time, and infrastructure is being developed and technology is being introduced, and so there's also a way of looking at that change that is a really exciting opportunity if you want it to be.
Yeah, I think certainly the content in relation to this, we always have to get this approved by the CEO of the council. So every artwork that goes on the bridge has to get the green light from the CEO of the council. And there have been examples actually where some of them were stopped from going ahead. For example, John Russell's commission on here, which was Margaret Thatcher's eyes, it was a small slit of Margaret Thatcher's eyes, was postponed because it came too close to the election. So the councils felt that it wasn't appropriate to be up there at the particular time that the gallery wanted it to be, and it was postponed by, I think, 2 to 3 months. Sharon might remember the date, I can't remember. But so there are instances where the content of a piece of public art will really dictate how easily it might come into life, I think. And the big screen is one example. James at the back, an assistant curator from Focal Point Gallery, actually manages the programme on the screen. And we've had no end of problems with people with films with swear words in them, even with nudity, basic nudity, that we just simply can't include on there. So it's well worth thinking about when you're considering a commission, is actually if it comes in front of a curator and it has difficult content like that in it, it's going to be problematic to deliver it in a public space. But I'd like to move on to Alan Kane. And me and Alan, I was just thinking about this, have been talking about public art for many, many years, because I did a horrendous public art commission that went horribly wrong and got cancelled in the end in Derby once. And I was telling Alan about it at some event, and he said to me, let me at the councillors, and I will walk them around Derby and talk to them about public art. And I tried to set it up, I really did, but they just weren't into it. But Alan has done some really quite amazing pieces of work in the public realm and that have involved communities. More recently, he shipped the British Art Show into the centre of Norwich on a horse-drawn carriages, and over Christmas was commissioned to do the Christmas lights at Tate Britain, which was probably one of the biggest sort of public art commissions over Christmas, I think, in that on a huge gallery. So I wonder if Alan could talk Christmas commission. I wonder if Alan could talk a little bit about his experiences of public art and approaches and things.
I will. So far it's all sounding a bit problematic, isn't it? It's all a bit of a headache, public art. But for me, well, first of all, there's a misconception. There's no distinction between a painting and any other form of art. You know, I don't know any works of art that an artist has intentionally set out to make a private work. So, you know, I think everyone involved in making art is on some level trying to engage with the public in a certain way, and the idea of working outside of, you know, so you start off thinking about maybe paintings, and with paintings you've got the opportunity to play with colour and shape, and if you think about sculpture, you've got the opportunity to play with colour, shape, and volume. And then if you go outside of that and you think about making what we're calling public art, you've got the opportunity to play with colour, shape, volume, and context. And context for me is the most exciting thing, because it makes exponentially variable opportunities. You can't, you know, colour and shape are enough things to try and consider. And if you add all these other things into times it by all these other things, you've just got a phenomenal amount of possibilities. And I think that's probably the thing for about the notion of public art that's most exciting. You can play with everything, and I think it's important for artists to sort of hold on to the idea that they've got a playground, and this is possibly the biggest playground possible. Okay, there are some drawbacks. You know, you've got to find millions of pounds. You've got to get permission from the most boring people on the planet. You've got to get you've got to get an idea. So, you know, there are some drawbacks, but it is the most, for me, I can't think of anything more fun than pulling off a quietly revolutionary gesture in the world, you know, and that can possibly happen in an art gallery. It did happen in art galleries. It can possibly happen, you know, in a park. But it definitely can happen on the high street, or in the middle of the ocean, or on the back of a bird flying across Southend. You know. So public art should be fun, guys. Come on. It's not all dour.
I mean, I completely agree with you, Alan. I think for me, actually, public art and some of the temporary commissions we've done with Focal Point Gallery have been some of the best bits about this job, really, because you get to see people experiencing it within their everyday life, and I think that's what art can be fantastically transformative when it's experienced like that. And I think your works particularly are interesting because you really play on that context, don't you? So I mean, in terms of when you approach, I don't know if would you be able to talk a bit about when you approach a commission or if someone asks you to do something, how you? I mean, maybe we could talk about.
We're back on that.
Maybe we could talk about the Radical National Trust of South Essex and where that came from.
Yeah. Okay. So for me, the ambition with this project is to make an object, which is a series of photographs that don't go on the internet, that go into a filing cabinet with a very secure lock and is fireproof, and goes into a building which nobody goes to, and gets locked away for 200 or 300 years potentially, and then becomes interesting because they're quite boring photographs they've taken, but after 300 years, anything's going to be fascinating from that period. So, there's an idea that you can make a public art which is for another time, perhaps. Or you can make a public artwork which is intentionally unseen. I don't know. I think context is the most fun to play with. I don't know. You're always playing with context anyway. Even if you make a work in an art gallery, there's the opportunity, and in fact, you can't avoid working with context. I don't think that's possible. But if you take on board the context in the process of making a work, well, for me anyway, it makes it much more fun, much more complex, much more fun. And talking to counsellors becomes part of the successes you have or the failures you have, where an artist in the studio might be struggling with somebody's hand in a portrait. You can struggle with a conversation with somebody that's got some authority over the land or the budget or the permissions that you need to do something, and you can, it's as just a creative a playground or an opportunity for creativity as any other. So all of these things become meat and potatoes potentially to your good artwork in public artist.
I mean, I think what's interesting about this one, the whole of this Radical Essex project was really responding to some of the perceptions and challenges of this particular part of England. And one thing that came up was a conversation I'd had with the National Trust. And I was telling Alan about it when we were beginning the commissioning process. And that's where this idea of creating our own Radical National Trust in South Essex really came from, because the National Trust came and said, we really want to work with galleries to commission artworks in National Trust properties. We really think you guys are the people that can help us to reanimate some of these properties that we own. And I said, yeah, great. So where are they then? Where are the properties near us? And they said, no, they're not in Essex. We actually don't own any properties in Essex. I said, right, okay, where's the nearest one? They went, Sutton Hoo in Suffolk. I was like, okay. So, but they do own an island in Essex, actually, so I have got my eye on that. But the idea that this woman came to talk to us and try and encourage us to work in the National Trust properties, but they don't deem... I mean, actually, they produced a map to show me as well, which had all of Suffolk and Norfolk and came down, and then Essex was just missing. And I said, well, where is it? Well, you should mark on the map where your gallery is. And I was like, well, it's down here on the table, basically. You're not even on the map. So Alan picked up on that point and really tried to... Well, he's continuing to work on creating an institution that can celebrate some of the unique Essex properties and even create little plaques that will go on some of these properties. So there is a public sort of...
There can be, yeah.
Yet to be decided.
Yeah. No, there will be, but it won't be necessary. It's a conversation, isn't it?
It's a continuing one. Okay, so let's move over to Matt Nightingale, who is the project manager for New Geographies. And I wonder if you could just give a little bit of background to the project, because I did such a terrible job at the beginning of this event. And maybe some of the information that people really need to know if they're considering an application to it. And then we will open it up so people can ask specific questions to anybody on the panel.
Okay. So I guess the first thing is I really like the idea of this playground where you have so many opportunities. And I think one of the interesting things about this project is there are so many locations. And one of the things that we didn't mention at the start is that all of the locations have been nominated by members of the public. So this is not about you deciding, I'm just going to put an artwork in a place that I think. That the idea is that the local community has nominated places that they think have been overlooked or forgotten and are worthy of some kind of recognition. So the project started out as an idea to sort of redraw a map of the region that isn't based on kind of traditional history or economic centres or that kind of thing. It's based on people's personal memories and places that they visited or things they've done as a kid. And those places have now sort of been left to one side, or they're buildings that have not been used, or developments that have stopped midway through and now they're just sort of sitting dormant. So what we're asking for is for artists to respond to these locations. And one of the other things that I wanted to mention is that this idea that all of this stuff that we've been talking about does seem slightly intimidating, or that you need permissions, you need planning, you need to talk to councillors. At this stage, we're looking for expressions of interest, and I think it's worth clarifying what that is. And it really is just what it sounds like. We're not looking for a fully formed project yet, so you don't need an entire developed project with a budget, with a permission to use a piece of land. We're looking for how you would approach a project more than what the project is definitely going to end up being. Because there will be a further stage, a sort of feasibility study and a development stage for a number of projects that we will end up shortlisting. So there will end up being 10 commissions, but we'll probably shortlist something like 25 projects from all of the submissions. And then those 25 projects will be given an opportunity to do site visits. We'll talk to the owners of the lands or the buildings. There'll be an opportunity to meet local community groups to try and engage the local community in what you're preparing. And then try and develop a proper kind of developed project from there. So in terms of your deadline for Sunday night, which is pretty imminent, it's more just how you feel like you would approach the project in general. You don't need the specifics just yet. And then in terms of the process, so if you go to the website, which is newgeographies.uk, there is a map which has all of the locations. You can hover over each one. There is a bit of text, which is basically the person that made a nomination was asked to give some indication as to why they nominated. Some of them are... Yeah, it hasn't been edited in any way. This is just as it's come. Some of them that have like an amazing essay of information. Some of them have literally nothing. Some are like, I'm nominating this station because I'm sitting waiting for a train and I may as well. There's a whole spectrum of stuff in there. So you can kind of go into as much research as you want. And there's an amazing array of places from, just a lump of concrete, which to some people might deserve a sculpture of some sort sitting on it, but maybe you want to think a bit more out of the box. So there's an artist brief on the website which you can download, which basically just gives a summary of the project, what we're looking for, who all of the partner organisations are. And then the way to, there's budget details. So there's 25 grand budget, we should say, per commission, which is inclusive of that. So it's really about 20 grand. So if you're proposing a project which is a 20-foot high bronze, it's not going to happen. So sort of be realistic about what you can achieve. But there is further funding to be sought for particular projects. If we can raise more money, we will raise more money. But this is what we have.
Anthony Gormley can afford to make that.
Anthony Gormley can afford something like that. He hasn't applied yet, which is strange. There's still 3 days for him to submit. The other thing we should maybe say is that there was a sort of connection with the Netherlands. So as part of this kind of development of artists in the region getting exposed to other people, we kind of approached some curatorial groups in the Netherlands and asked them to kind of contribute Dutch artist names that would maybe be interested in joining us, and also asked them to kind of help look through the submissions. So there's a bit of an exchange thing going on between some Dutch partners, just because of the kind of geographical connection and and it's a good way to sort of broaden the people that might see your work. You know, you're living in this region, you're applying for things in the region, but actually it's also kind of nice if people further afield get to see what your work is. And the other thing that is really a focus, which is explained in here, but so I've been monitoring the kind of info at email address, and I get so many questions every day from people that haven't really necessarily read the documents that thoroughly. But one thing we're sort of really stressing is community engagement is a big part of this project. And you can take that to whatever level you want, but it's something that you should consider. So it's not about you as an artist saying, I want to make this work and I want to put it there, and that's, you know, they'll love it because there's an artwork in their community that wasn't there before, therefore they've had some beneficial experience. You want the local community to feel like they're sort of buying into the whole process and buying into the project, because the idea is to make a new map of the region, and if their location is part of that map, you want them to feel like they're involved somehow. So that doesn't mean that you have to get some local community group to help make a work, but it means maybe try and find a way to engage them in the process or in the making or in the thought behind it, or, you know, however you feel, but something that you should definitely consider. And then the submission process itself, if we can go back to the website, is through a website called Submittable, for obvious reasons. And it's basically a portal through which you need to submit. So we're not accepting any submissions via email or anything like that. It's only through this website. So this basically has the same kind of summary, and there are some boxes to fill in with 500 words for a sort of overview of your practice, upload links so you can add your portfolio, some images of your work, but you need to make an account to fill it in. And then once we have all of these submissions, then there's a sort of steering group from all of the partner organisations that will be shortlisting. Does that summarise everything? There's also frequently asked questions on there to avoid frequently asked questions being asked. Yeah.
That's what we're here tonight for, Matt. Yeah. I was just going to say that I was there at the beginning of this project, really. Matt, I know you weren't, so I was just going to give a little bit of a... Sorry, I know you've been a very good introduction to the project, absolutely wonderful, but... Yeah. Really, we developed this project partly because all of these organisations have worked together in the past on a project called Eastern Pavilions, which is a print project developing prints from artists, really about generating revenue. And it's a really strong group. It's called the CVAN group. It's the Contemporary Visual Arts Network for the east of the country. And I think there was a feeling that the group was ready to take on an enormous project again. And so we sat down in a locked room to develop a project that would satisfy all partners, which I must admit was a tricky thing. But I think actually what we've come out with is something really quite interesting. And we started with the context of the Netherlands and how it really has strong relationships to this part of the country, not only in the landscape but also in the involvement of the Dutch in a lot of reclaiming a lot of the land, particularly in Norfolk. Canvey Island was reclaimed by the Dutch in Essex as well. And also trying to sort of think about the notion of Brexit and connecting back into with our closest sort of continental neighbours. It sort of moved on a little bit, but the principle of trying to develop a series of commissions that exist in sort of forgotten parts of the east of the country. So trying to open up to the public to select areas that they think that an artist could come in and do such a wonderful job at bringing some of the stories of that place alive. And so we've had a really quite overwhelmed by the number of locations, and some of these locations have been nominated many, many times as well. So this isn't the overall number of nominations. And just to be clear at this stage, I just wanted to say you don't have to pick a nomination in order to make a submission. It is obviously an option that people can make specific.
Yeah, I think it would be good
to have looked at the map.
It would definitely be good to have looked at the map, yeah. And it would probably be good to have an idea of the type of location that would be appropriate for what you're thinking. So
Okay.
maybe like, a handful of options.
Okay.
But it's not a requirement.
Not a requirement.
I think that's an interesting point, actually. Can I just butt in there? if I was an artist thinking about this, would I be able to put forward more than one proposal in your... Okay. Because I've certainly done that before. For one open call, I've put in 4 proposals. So I think it's worth thinking about that, you know. Just fire off as many as you can think of.
But the other thing is that... Yeah, sorry, go.
That's absolutely definitely an option, but try and keep it into one submission. Because if we get multiple submissions by the same person, I suspect that they're going to get skipped because someone's going to think, oh, that's another entry by the same person that we've already kind of quantified as a yes or a no or a maybe. So, and because we're just looking at an expression of interest, you don't want to be repeating your CV, your sort of personal statement, your images of previous works multiple times. You can just say in the single application, I've got a variety of ideas, something about this type of location or this type of location. Anywhere.
I think, Matt, you touched on something really, really important with this as well, in that actually what is quite exciting about this project for curators as well is that we are going to get to see a huge number of proposals that could fill programs for everything for the next sort of 30 years in this part of the country. So even if you aren't successful for this particular project, it's really an interesting range of organisations that will get to see your proposal, see how you work as well, and that's hugely beneficial to people. So I think that's a good thing to point out. Okay, as this is a surgery, I think we should open it out to the floor. If anyone's got any questions that they want to ask any of the panel. We've got quite a few already. I think we'll start in the front here, and then we'll take Jonathan at the back, and we'll come over here shortly. So this lady in the front with the black and white.
Hi. I'm wondering, are you looking for permanent pieces of art, temporary pieces of art, or some combination of the two?
Anywhere between both ends, if that's
okay.
So it could be a one-off event, it could be a permanent sculpture, and it could be anything in between. Like we're trying to keep the scope as wide as possible because we want the broadest range of applications possible from the broadest range of artists working in different styles.
And a related question as to sites.
Yeah.
Are you looking for work that's going to be placed near these locations, or are some of these going to be commissioned for the arts organizations whose project this is, or again, some combination?
Well, I think the ideal is that the work is sited at the site, because the point is to sort of celebrate these places in themselves. So we want people to go and visit a place that they wouldn't necessarily have known about or bothered to visit in the past. But that being said, there are so many locations that have been nominated, we haven't even begun to look at whether any of these sites are usable.
Well, that's what
because
I was going to say.
That's a huge, we would spend the entire project budget just doing that piece of work.
Yeah.
So this is why, if you submit saying, I'm looking to do this kind of project in this kind of environment, pick a few places maybe, because the first one that we come to, there might just be an outright no, or it might be it's just been sold to a developer who says no, or, there needs to be an element of flexibility, which is where the next sort of feasibility stage comes into play.
But I suppose that's where this sort of conversation will begin, really. Like we were talking about with Rose and Kiera and Alan, that actually that always happens with public art commissions, doesn't it? Even if you've got the money and the site, it's not necessarily a done deal, as we know. Exactly. It is really about it starts a conversation that will develop, and the work may change through that as well, because there might be certain restrictions that hadn't been considered before, and then the work often adapts as well, and that can be interesting through that conversation, like Alan was saying, with particular councillors and things. I think see this very much, as Matt said, as like obviously realistic proposals, but proposals that really sort of are idealistic as well in terms of the location and scope, because I think that's what the curators that are involved are going to be looking for, because everybody's very passionate about their particular part of the East and want to see an incredible range of commissions come forward. So that's what people are going to be looking for, and then they will be with you on the journey of trying to make what you want to do happen. Is that true? Yeah. So John, you had a question at the back there, didn't you?
You kind of just answered it a little bit. I was basically going to ask, how involved are these sites already in the project? Do any of them even know they've been
They're not involved in any way, but some of them know, because I've had a few people email. Some of them are conscious of it, yeah. Partly because we've got a marketing department and press, and there's been local press happen. So, yeah, certain locations are aware of it, but there's been no kind of formal agreement that you've been nominated. Are you okay with it? So, we've had a few people email in saying, I've already been and spoken to this site. They've never heard of the project, but they're happy to go ahead. That kind of thing. So, yeah, it's all still up in the air in terms of permissions and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and sorry, I've got one last thing to.
Yeah.
So in terms of I guess this falls into the next step of usual. If you did get through to the next stage, you start developing the project. Within that budget, I mean, some of these areas that I've looked at on the map are quite remote, and they're not sort of something that people pass on their everyday tracks and that kind of thing. And I mean, would we have to include making it accessible? There's one kind of fort on there, I think, that has got a ditch next to it that we've kind of looked up. It's there's quite clear kind of public right of way. That would probably be the easiest way to get to it. But then would we have to include building a bridge if we were going to get people over there? How? I mean, in a way, the £25,000 sounds like a lot of money to make something really cool happen, but at the same time, you have to think about all the logistics as well. I just wanted to.
Yeah.
That's just a conversation.
I think that's going to be a case-by-case discussion, and I suppose things like that will probably is where we'll do additional fundraising per project for things like that are additional requirements to the project itself. So I think just consider the budget as being the production of the work and the artist fee, and sort of peripheral stuff on top of that is where the additional fundraising will come from. So.
Thank you. Hey, awesome. We're using, so there's a collective that I'm part of that is applying, and I'm applying as a collaboration with someone else. Sorry, awesome. Sorry. I'm planning on applying as part of a collective, and then also planning on applying as the lead artist as part of a collaboration. Is that okay?
You mean as two separate submissions,
yeah.
Two separate groups?
With two separate, completely different. Yeah,
totally
okay, good.
Yeah.
I just wanted to check that before I was like, yeah, I'm doing this.
Yeah.
And the other question I had was, obviously it's a visual arts network. My practice is sonic and live immersive sound installation with durational performance, and so there is a visual aspect to it, but it works with sound as its primary material.
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay?
I mean, I think the boundaries between types of art these days are very blurred. I mean, I don't really see any difference between sound and visual art.
Okay.
It's definitely okay.
That's
answer
good.
your question.
That's good.
Yeah, but I think I've had this question a lot from I want to do a performance, I want to submit a performance or music as opposed to sort of installation sound. I mean, I think we should sort of keep it as open as possible.
Thank you.
I mean, yeah, I think I just wanted to add to that as well, like John's point as well about the bridge and and accessibility. So sometimes public art for me, or art in the public space, to credit Alan, can often be a piece of sound or something you download and listen to on an iPhone or a book. It doesn't necessarily need to physically manifest itself in that particular space either. And that, thinking about the budget, it is a challenging budget if you've got to construct huge structures and things and think about accessibility. And as Matt said, it's a starting point for a project, and there can be further fundraising that the institution can do alongside the artist. But also think about how those different ways of working can actually be experienced, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a physical manifestation in the landscape or It can take the form of many different things, like a performance. There's no limit on the sort of how long it has to last as well. It could last for 2 seconds. It could last for 2 years or 100 years, really. I think everything's on the table.
I think one thing that I would consider, though, is if you're planning something that's temporal in nature, like a performance, it would be maybe good to think about, is there any way to have some kind of evidence of that can be left in the space, or
So legacy.
yeah, something that doesn't have to be the performance itself, but some record of it at least.
Yeah,
I think that would be helpful. No.
I had a
Thank you.
question at the back here, actually. It's made it.
Okay. Hi, thanks. I was just going to ask a similar question about sound, actually. So I'm a composer, and I noticed that it says on your... I'm really interested in your work because I work with maps and sound and memories all the time, actually, on my own work. So, but it says on your documentation that you're a visual sound network. So would I be kind of like prejudiced if I say I'm a composer because it's kind of music, rather than if I said that I was a sound artist? Would that be different? Would that be more open? I mean, I'm thinking about the way that the work or the kind of proposal would be judged in respect to sound and image and vision. Because it's a serious point, actually, because of a lot of artists are working with sound and image at the moment, and it's important to me.
I think it's a valid point, for sure. I mean, I would say whether you classify yourself as a composer or a sound artist, you're essentially doing the same thing. I suppose in terms of the criteria for the submission, what the group that would be shortlisting would need to see is just kind of some record of your ability to create the work and to produce a good
cool.
result at the end.
That's lovely. That's kind of all
there's
I
no
need.
reason why you can't apply as a composer.
Great. So the other thing, I've come from London, and I was just wondering, are you? Is it just for East artists from the East?
Absolutely not. No, I think it really is.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
and I think there are submissions coming in from international artists from London. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
That's great. Thank you very much.
I think superb. I would just add to that. For me, really anything goes in terms of how you want to approach a piece of work, really, whether it be just sound or whether it be something that manifests itself. I mean, I suppose there is something to be said about how you write about that. Just bear in mind that the majority of the selection institutions will be visual arts minded. So how, like Matt said, talk about sonic arts and how you think about time and performance, I think is worth considering in how you actually just write about it.
Yeah.
But in terms of different types of approaches, I don't think that there's no restriction, is there? No.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Thanks.
Any further questions? Heidi, you can have this one.
Okay. Well, I'm a little bit unclear as to who the selection panel is and actually what the process is. I wonder if you can say something about that. And slightly cynical question, is this a genuinely open submission, or are there already artists in mind, as there very often are with these things?
Okay, good questions. So are there already artists in mind? No, is the honest answer. We have advertised it in a lot of places, so it has garnered a lot of interest. But one thing that is definitely part of the process that we want to have a spectrum of artists. We're not just trying to find the known names and then find 10 commissions for 10 sort of celebrity artist types. We want a spectrum. And the spectrum is going to be, geographical, because we don't want to have 10 commissions in Essex. I mean, not that that's a bad thing, but the whole point is to have a geographical spread and to have a balance of artists at different levels of their career. So, I do believe it is genuinely an open call. And I've forgotten what your other question was. Oh, the process. So the selection committee is basically the kind of lead curators from each of the partner organisations.
Well, essentially, so how it's going to work in detail is that each institution, or the curator representing that institution, will select 25 proposals that resonate with them, and then so each of the 9 institutions will bring their 25 to an open forum event where we will talk around the table about what's, are there any, has everybody selected one, are there other ones that come up many times, if that's the case, then I suppose it'll just be a fight to the death to see who gets that particular commission. But it'll essentially be that of the sort of pool of all of those things that people bring to the table, then we will sit down with the map and try and work out a pattern for which to commission this huge project. Is that right?
Yeah. We should also probably just say that there is a list of criteria that every person is kind of working towards. So this is why I said the kind of community engagement thing is important, because that is one of the criteria, because that, like, we've got Arts Council funding, so there is criteria that we have to match. So we can't just give it to the big name artist because they submitted, even if if they didn't match the criteria, then there's no way to kind of quantify that. So if you kind of read the brief and sort of take out the points from the brief that are listed as sort of the criteria of the project, like community engagement, like thinking about place, then I think if you match those criteria, then you're kind of going to get a good hit rate on the sort of checklist. I don't know if that's necessarily true. I mean, this is why we want to have a spread of projects, but yeah.
I think it's worth just reinforcing, because it is a good point, because quite often in these things there are artists in people's minds and things, but there was a lot of discussion about this, wasn't there, in the project board, and there were a lot of people saying, maybe we should have some artists, some artists won't want to fill out the form, and we absolutely all agreed that couldn't happen, that the selection was completely open to the public, and that the proposals had to be, and every artist had to fill out the proposal form, and it had to go through this process. So there aren't any pre-commissioned artists at all, so it is completely open. And actually, as we go through this process, I am really excited about going into this with a completely open mind to see what comes out of all the proposals, because, as I said, it's quite rare to get so many wonderful artists and proposals coming in front of you and be able to sort of read through them and look through the work. So it's going to be really great, I think. Are there any further questions that we can? Take that one. And I'm going to come back to you.
All right. I'm sorry. This is a little bit of a gripe, really, because I've only just heard about this. You say on the top of this statement here that in the summer of 2017 you invited the public to nominate overlooked or forgotten places. Can you tell me where? Because I never heard about it, and so I've not even had the chance of nominating a place.
Well, we're working with like an arts marketing and press company. When the website went live, there was various bits of press around the BBC, all the regional newspapers featured it. There was various online stories and blogs and websites. I mean, it's kind of difficult to get everybody to see everything, especially these days when there's so much out there. And it was widely kind of advertised around the region, and it was featured on the BBC Online a few times.
Well, I'm afraid I never saw any of it.
I suppose it's worth looking at the map, actually, because there might be a chance that someone has nominated somewhere that you, by chance, you never know, that you wanted to nominate. Because, well, it's possible. Are there any further questions? Yeah, down at the front here.
Hello. Mine's a bit off topic from the submission. It was a question for Alan, actually. Hello. I just wanted to know, you all mentioned with public art there's obviously a lot of regulations and rules. As an artist, do you feel that ever you need to make sacrifices that you maybe wouldn't want to make, or that art can possibly suffer as a result of making it so accessible to the public? Or it sounds to me that you sort of embrace that challenge and that's part of the fun. You don't? You love it?
I love it. I think for me it's the most interesting bit. So you're always making sacrifices, you know. Yeah. You're in a studio, you've got a big fat brush and a little thin brush, you haven't got a middle-sized brush. You're going to just try it with a big brush and try it with a little brush, aren't you? So you're always making sacrifices. It's the same process. I see it exactly the same. You do have to accommodate some dull people. I mean, that's the hardest thing. You have to, and keep smiling. That's the hardest thing. Trying to think what would be. To be honest, I must have been lucky because there haven't been any total catastrophes. And you've always got the option of pulling out, you know, because none of these things are worth that much money, frankly. Yeah. So just walk, you know. But it's an interesting, I don't know. I suppose for me, I quite like the idea that you can turn it. And often where you think you want it to be, and I really like being open to this notion, where you think you want it to be at the beginning changes, and that, you know, I've on a very personal level, I want to be different. I want to change, I want to learn, and you know, I think that if you want to do that, then it's a good way. You know, if you involve other people in your decision making in any way, then you're going to have to learn something.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hello. I'm actually a planning officer at Southend Council, or as Alan describes, one of those boring people on the planet.
That's true.
You spoke earlier about some work you've been doing about over the last 30 to 40 years about the public art of the borough. I just wondered what that informs, and has it, you know, does it lead to something big, or is it related to this project only?
No, it's not really related to this project. I mean, Focal Point has always, over the last sort of 6 years or so, has ventured out of the gallery walls and done a series of temporary commissions in and around Southend. And initially, it was part of an Arts Council funded project called Focal Point 2, but it was so brilliant, engaging audiences that the gallery had never done. We actually continued that program of commissioning in different places, and whilst it's always a challenge to do it from a funding perspective, because our core funding covers our exhibitions in the gallery and that's it, we felt that it was important. And then that sort of exploded into the Radical Essex project, which was essentially a tourism and culture project. It was about linking the tourism sector and the cultural sector together in Essex, particularly around Colchester and Southend. And we actually ended up leading that project because the institution that was leading it could no longer take it on. And we said the plan was to sort of make a website and blog about where the best hotels were and sort of where you could buy paints and things. And we just said this isn't going to be interesting to us because we're commissioners, we're not tourism people. Whilst we want to learn about the tourism sector, we want to get out there and find some of the stories in Essex that people might have overlooked and things that might start to challenge some of the perceptions that people thought about. So we actually, from going a little bit out of the gallery, we went across the entire county and carried on commissioning. So, and then working with closely with a partner in town, Metal, as well, who ran the Estuary Festival last year. The two organisations have become very interested in what public art's doing in Southend, and I think looking at some of the commissions that have gone into Southend over the past 20 years, some of them have been quite poor, really, and decisions around those commissions have been dubious with councillors, and I think we felt that that actually there needed to be a new start. So we've actually been working with the planning team on a number of Section 106 commissions actually, and trying to introduce new ways of working in the Shoebury project that Rose talked about. There's also a project we're working on in relation to 2 laundries actually that were turned into housing estates in the Victoria ward as well. And just trying to think about public art in a slightly different way, and get some of the council workers and councillors interested in the possibilities of public art. And what that's actually led to is, and this hasn't been announced publicly, but we can sort of mention it briefly now, is that both Metal and Focal Point have been invited together to develop a new cultural strategy, including a public art strategy for Southend. So collaboratively to write a sector-led strategy rather than it being a council-imposed strategy. So that work is just beginning now, and hopefully, we can develop something that's really, really meaningful. I mean, I met colleagues from Bedford Council, which is a unitary authority like Southend as well, and they've done a sector-led cultural strategy, which is producing some really fantastic projects and really engaged community work. So rather than councils, we've managed to persuade Southend Borough Council that a sector-led approach to these strategies is better than somebody writing the strategy and uploading it to the internet and it's sitting there and nobody even reading it. And Rose has been helping with some of that work, particularly around councillor education, of how you sort of engage with public art. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. But we haven't met, but it'd be good to sort of meet and talk a bit about that. Yeah. Are there any further questions from out there of any nature? It doesn't have to be about the Commission, but to any of our panel. Yeah, sure.
Slightly. Oh, which
one? You go for it. Go.
Thanks. It strikes me that, art sort of has to be popular these days. Alan, I loved your piece at Tate Britain. It was really popular. Everyone really loved it and were really enjoying it on site. And also, Jeremy Deller's TFL and 1418 recent projects. They're just kind of, but it's sort of, how important does it seem to do something, for example, for this project, that it should be popular?
I mean, I think things can work on different registers. So, I mean, we've spoken about quite specific things. And I think we definitely try and do work that will appeal to people at different kind of interests as well. So we might work, and we're working with Heather Phillipson on a massive project at the moment. And what's great about Heather's work is, I don't know if you all know her work, but it looks very pop. So it's very aesthetically pleasing. So someone that's not necessarily an art lover can enjoy it on an aesthetic level, but you scratch the surface and there's something much more political there. So I personally try and program projects that work across a spectrum. So something like Nina's project, which is we're trying to develop together, is much more kind of social in nature, and it's much more about trying to get to the heart of what is happening in that area. And that will probably be a kind of book or a live performance. We're not quite sure yet. So I think trying to have a balance, yeah, definitely, if that answers your question. Do you want to say something on those?
Well, I suppose, I think the thing that I would say is that actually it's very difficult to anticipate what's going to be popular very often. So things really can take you by surprise, that people kind of go, somehow something registers with people, like you're saying, and so something all of a sudden gains momentum and becomes very visible and very popular in that way. But it's pretty impossible to program with that in mind. I guess through this conversation, a little bit of what has been running through my mind is a question of, like, okay, what do I think makes a good public art project? What do I and this idea of context and to whom one is speaking and how one is listening and what you're trying to communicate and what you're learning through that communication feels like it's for me really important, and that's kind of what makes a good public art project. And the reason that those things become popular maybe is because they speak to people and people feel like there's a dialogue with them and they understand them on a different level, and there's a way of having a kind of correspondence. And when you hit that, it's amazing. but it's not something that you can, I don't think, whether you're a curator or even an artist, necessarily set out to do. It's just kind of a little bit of the magic that happens. But that when you're looking for projects, what you're looking for is things that feel like they have a clear sense of what the conversation might be and how they might go about starting that conversation.
I'm trapped. God, I'm trapped. Are there any further questions that anyone has? I think what we'll do is, in a moment, we'll be around. There's still drinks available at the bar and things if people want to stick around. I'm sure people won't mind answering any further questions and things that people might not feel like they want to put out into right now. But you sort of summed up a little bit, but are there any other comments on the panel now we've been through this process that anybody wants to add to Alan or Kiera or Rose?
I kind of just really second what you say. It's context. Context. That's better. But I mean, it's really important to me when I'm starting a project. I spend so much time in the area and talking to people, and you're waiting. I think you were talking about those kind of magic moments that might happen, those unheard stories, and I think that can be the spark that will make something that's really like exciting and really celebrates an area.
But I think sometimes it's interesting if somebody comes into a place that it has to learn that as part of the process, and you can have good outcomes when people from other places come in and have to and really have to engage with you, and they can see things that maybe people that live in those areas don't necessarily see. I mean, you're in an advantage, definitely, because at least you'll know some of the... Well, I think you'll have a good...
I would add a little bit about the context of this particular situation applying for this particular project. Your context is that you've got, 15, 20 people sitting in a room looking at 150, 300 applications. That's your initial context. So it's worth thinking about that when writing your application. And it sort of ties in with your question about popularism, Actually, you've got a job to get over something kind of appealing to at least some of those people quite quickly. So, I mean, that's a context that's worth considering in this particular instance, I think.
Is there anything, Matt, you want to add before people run to the website? Or just forget about the idea of doing it at all?
Yeah, we haven't put you off already. I would just say, I would apply with something that makes you feel excited, not trying to second guess what everyone else is going to think about that project. So, not trying to make something popular because you think popular is what we're looking for, because I don't think that is what we're looking for. We're looking for the projects that's interesting and is going to inspire conversation, and it's going to sort of spread some interest around different walks of life, not just art world people, but the general populace. But that doesn't mean it needs to just be kind of generic, and it doesn't need to be safe to still be interesting to the wider population.
No, I'm done.
Okay, I think what we'll do is leave it there. Oh, is there another question? Just one more question. Just shout. Just shout.
There's a question in the there's a question in the application process. The overview question, 300 words question. So, why is your experience relevant for a project of this type? Before that, I can answer that bit. Before, why would you like to be considered for this project? And I think, bloody hell, that's quite hard to do. In 100 words, what kind of thing would you, because that's what do you mean?
I actually don't know what we mean there. I think for me, that's really a bit similar to if you've ever applied for a grants for the arts bid to the Arts Council. People always spend ages on the first bit that's like, what is your project? What do you want to do? And actually, when you talk to the Arts Council officers, and Matt, you might be able to corroborate this, I don't know. The third box down, which says that everyone always goes, oh, I won't bother with that, I'll leave that till the last minute, which is, how will this grant affect you as an artist? Or how will this make a difference to you? That's actually the most important box for them. It's like, actually, that's the one that they really focus on, because it's like, because you could have in front of you somebody assessing your application that is a dance specialist, a theatre specialist, a visual. You really can't predict who's the application's going to fall in front of. But what they want to know fundamentally is, if they give you this money, what impact is it going to have on you as a creative professional? Ultimately, we're all here to ensure that the Arts Council, that Britain has a really strong range of creative people working within it and in its context, and I think that's the key, I think, to that question. Is that right?
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah. It really is about, if you get this, what does it mean for you as an artist? And I think that's. But that third box on the grants for the arts, don't forget it, because I don't even think they read the first two. So, is that right?
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
When I was at my interview for the degree I did at Central St Martin, the tutor said to me, which of these works that you've shown us would you choose as the most important one, you see? I've been taking walks around a local fishing pool and just taking photographs of the water patterns. And I had all these photographs and I was wondering what to do with them. And I was technically obsessed with this, about different exposures of photographs, etc., etc. And I eventually just decided to put them in a grid. And when I put this on at the end of the year, one of the technicians said, I really love that work. It makes me feel peaceful. Now, I've been obsessed with the technical side of this. The reason I used to go around this pool was because it made me feel peaceful. And it's an intangible thing. This technician said, it makes me feel peaceful. But, oh God, I'm communicating something with this. And it's something you can't really plan for.
Yeah, no, I think, and that's probably a good point to raise about what we talked about earlier. We did sort of focus on a lot of the practicalities and funding and difficulties, but as Matt said, this is just the start of the conversation. Get a great project on paper, and let's see if we can make it happen. And we're all going to be here to help it work out. Really, I think is the thing to end on. And on that note, I think we should end, and I'd like you all to just say a really great thank you to our panelists.